I saw that, well, if you're just allowing identity politics to happen for every single group and celebrating it for every single group except for white people, like, you're going to actually create that white supremacy, that white identity politics that was currently just barely there.
We're officially approaching the 5th month of Donald Trump's presidency. So he started on January 20th, and we're in late May now. So we're heading into that 5th month, and it has been as the approach to DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, quote unquote wokeness, is concerned, aggressive, radical, and as promised for the most part. Now, we've hosted the conversation here. We've tried to do as much as we possibly could, evaluating the efficacy of Trump's approach to kind of pulling out the roots of quote unquote wokeness from academia and culture, whether it's through enforcement of civil rights law, whether it's through the threats to academic public funding, taxpayer funding of places like Harvard, which has been very aggressive and maybe in ways that people who want to defund Harvard and Yale and all those guys are even uncomfortable with and find to be undermining the ultimate goal. We've done our best here to have that conversation. And it brings up one of the more interesting questions, which is during the Biden years and even during the first Trump years, a lot of people were alienated from the broader left, from the project that is the American left, because they were uncomfortable with where the left was going on race, on sex, on gender, on identity politics in general. And that came to be known as wokeness. And a lot of those people ended up shifting their politics. They ended up shifting their allegiance. They ended up finding common cause with the right. And this coalition sprung up of what's called, the Barstool conservatives, kind of libertarian, anti-woke people who are also anti-social conservative. Some people who are just plainly center left with social conservatives. And it's always been a fragile coalition. And like the right during the Cold War, where communism was the glue that held it together, wokeness was the glue that held this coalition together. And so if wokeness sort of starts to fade away, then what happens? What happens to that coalition? Do the ex-left people go back to the left? Do the social conservatives end up losing a lot of their power because what was giving them momentum and power was that they were vocal and sort of structural opponents of something that most of the country really disliked, which was quote unquote wokeness? We're joined today by Colin Wright. Colin is an evolutionary biology PhD. He is the CEO and editor in chief of Reality's Last Stand. He is a fellow at the Manhattan Institute and the host of the Citation Needed podcast, co-host of the Citation Needed podcast. He's at the center of the debate over what the woke right is and whether the woke right even exists. You may remember we had James Lindsay on the show not too long ago to kind of go through that debate. Personally, I just have a lot of thoughts on the debate. I don't really have a hard position on it. I'm curious about it, and I hope to have somebody on soon who can talk a little bit about why they think James and Colin are wrong on the woke right. But today I want to talk to Colin. I want to get his thoughts on all of this because we're certainly in the middle of a big shift, and I want to sort of pause and take stock of where we are. So Colin Wright, thank you so much for being here.
I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, of course. I'm really curious to talk to you about the future of I want to say the right, but I also kind of mean the anti-left. And when I say anti-left, I kind of mean anti-progressive left, like anti-cultural progressivism. I guess coalition, because it's very interesting. And just to get into that conversation, the IRS is now being sued by American Oversight, which is a watchdog group for they want to get records on Trump's attacks on Harvard. And the academia part of this is actually pretty interesting because it seems like it's one of the places where most people on the right agree with the Trump administration, but you're someone who's followed the extreme absurdities of how what's called wokeness has affected academia, not just in the last couple of years, but for decades. And I just wanted to start by asking you, do you think that the Trump administration is kind of making a dent in that by the actions it's taken, through civil rights law, and the way that it's enforced, through the threats to Harvard and funding and all of that? Like, what's your take now that we're, May, 5 months of the administration?
hmm I think there's several things wrong with academia. We have, as you mentioned, sort of the ideological side. I spend a lot of time sort of debunking a lot of the crazy studies that come out of these really woke fields, and even in very serious journals like Nature too, like all the pseudoscience that's coming out of there.
Hmm.
But then there's the other side, which is having to do with their policies surrounding DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion,
Hmm.
and how this is used for hiring and promotion. Pretty much in most universities, when I was applying for universities to be a professor in 2018, a good proportion of them had these, you had to just submit like a DEI statement, and you're just basically talking about why you deserve to be hired. You have to stress your, if you're of a certain race, you want to put that in the foreground, or if you're a white male, you want to put that down and try to stress other things. It really turned into like a political and kind of a racial litmus test. So I think the Trump administration is going after, I think rightfully, the DEI aspect of it,
Hmm.
because it is a kind of a form of affirmative action. It does treat people as representatives of their racial group rather than as individuals based on merit. And so I think there's good things happening there, at least potentially. Now, on the other side, the ideological side, um, you're not going to really change what a lot of the scholars who've been hired in a lot of these fields are studying. You might be able to cancel certain grants that are associated with, maybe some of these things, but a lot of these in the sociology departments and the women's studies departments, they're not really on grants. They're just getting paid by the university themselves, and they can just write whatever they want. They can talk about how sex is a social construct or how pregnancy isn't really or shouldn't be rooted in biology, but rather in identity and performance, all this type of stuff. So, um, on the DEI front, yes, think Trump is doing well. On the ideological side of things, it's much harder to root out.
So yeah, that's the reason I wanted to ask that question first. Is that a lot of people look back on the years of the Cold War, and I think it's true that anti-communism was the glue that held the conservative coalition together. I should say the Republican coalition together. Fusionism, you have neoconservative, social conservatives, and fiscal conservatives, all the three legs of the three-legged stool that Frank Meyer talked about. And it seems to me like in the last 5 years, the glue that's held this interesting anti-woke coalition together has been wokeness. It's sort of brought the barstool conservatives together with the social conservatives, with the fiscal conservatives like Elon Musk, who are anti-waste, fraud, and abuse in government. And I wonder if it feels right now like the coalition is splintering, especially over Israel. And you've been a part of the kind of woke right discourse, debating what that means and how things are playing out. But it seems to me like actually this foil and this glue is probably going to be around a lot longer than it may feel to people in these early days of an administration that took some aggressive action. But it's kind of like you're trying to sweep up the ocean, like sweep up the beach. Like there's so much more to go.
Yeah, I think anti-wokeness was probably the biggest rallying cry to make this like this big tent conservatism. I made that meme that was sort of the political landscape meme where, it looks like the left left me, they went super woke and they dragged the center out to the left with them, even though I hadn't changed my position. Like
Hmm.
I considered all of myself to be just like a classical liberal type where I was concerned with women's rights and, the MLK type race issues, judging people by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. I've been a big free speech guy my entire life. And then watching the left sort of systematically abandon all of these, they
Hmm.
can't define a woman. So how do you define, how do you be concerned with women's rights if you don't know what a woman is? They've really adopted that DEI critical race theory perspective where they're really elevating group identity over individual merit. And then they constantly talk about free speech and they'll use scare quotes, that type of thing.
Mm.
So they're really not champions of these. So when I looked at the political landscape, it was sort of where do I see my values that I've always had reflected? And it sort of shifted to the center right. And I think a lot of people that were in my position saw that. And so the right was able to capture a lot of those in their sort of big tent. But we are seeing these little splits now because you can only be a big tent, or at least that's a strategy when you want to poach people away from a dominant party or a
Mm.
culturally dominant one.
Mm.
But once the right gets more power, then they kind of start drawing the lines within. And I think we're seeing this now too. We have, kind of like the white Christian nationalist part of things. There's been this sort of similar awakening on the right in a way where they're adopting a lot of the same views of like structural inequalities and uh, this kind of critical consciousness, waking up to the it usually involves the Jews running everything in their minds. And a lot of people have called this the woke right because it does sort of adopt this critical theory, critical consciousness, awake to these power structures that we're not allowed to talk about type of thing. And that's, I think, just a major battle line right now on the right. It's probably partially driven because all the people on the left are off X now, and so we only see each other to fight with. And but it's I think it's good to track the infighting that's going on, but I think it's going to be pretty consequential in the next several years.
I'm curious how you see yourself as somebody who's kind of gone through the last, like, the very turbulent last 10 years. And like, do you still feel like it's the parties or the movements, like broader left and right, that have shifted, or did the last 10 years shift you in any particular directions? I think it shifted a lot of people. But do you feel like you changed, or more the politics changed around you and you stood still?
Yeah, th that last bit. I think the political landscape has shifted around me. I've always really just maintained my same values that I kind of mentioned earlier, and that's what the meme, the cartoon I made was meant to sort of depict. Um, yeah, I mean, I've always maintained again, like the women's rights, the MLK approach to race issues, free speech. I'm still that way. I have never been a political partisan. Again, I've only used to vote Democrat because that's where my values were most reflected, and I've only just recently shifted to voting Republican because I just think my values are most reflected there. But I have no allegiance, no tribal affinity to either side. I'll just continue voting wherever those values are are most reflected. And we're seeing the right shift now, maybe rightward, and adopt these identity politics that I certainly don't like. So it's entirely conceivable that I will be voting for the Democrats again in the future at some point. I don't know if that's going to be next election or 8 years from now, but we'll see. It's entirely conceivable, and I have no qualms with doing that. I left the left, was ostracized for that. I'm not afraid of that type of ostracism. I've sort of insulated myself from cancellation, so I'm in a position where I can just sort of, I guess, speak my mind.
And I assume you don't agree with the Dave Smith, Tucker Carlson take that political Zionism is identity politics, which is an interesting part of the broader woke right debate. Is like, who's actually? It's like some people hear woke right and they're like, oh, you're talking about, the what's the right word? Like you said, white Christian nationalists, like the anti-Israel crowd. Some people assume you're talking about the Israel crowd because of political Zionism. Like, how do you parse the role of identity? Are both of the sort of hardened ends of the spectrum engaging in identity politics on that issue? How do you see that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a complex question. So this has happened recently on X, where people say, you're against identity politics, and then people will bring up like Israel and Zionism. Isn't that identity politics? And I think it's important for at least me to convey and clarify that when I say I'm against identity politics, I'm against, identity politics based on really unimportant, superficial traits like just
Hmm.
your skin color, the sex that you happen to be. I guess maybe some context where like bathrooms and sports that
Hmm.
definitely matters. But otherwise, there's that caveat that like identity politics around irrelevant traits. I think it's perfectly fine to have certain identity-based politics around shared values, around a sort of national pride. I think this helps actually unite a bunch of different groups within a nation.
Huh.
And so when I look at what Israel, I see, Judaism is a sort of values and belief system. There's also their context in the world is completely different. They're being attacked primarily based on their identity, and if they didn't stress these types of Jewish values that they have, they would be overtaken and probably slaughtered. And so I don't think we can just like take the example of Israel and just transmogrify it onto the United States and be like, well, we can't be for a type of sort of identity politics over there, but not but against it here for some reason. But the United States, it's already this sort of melting pot, bunch of different races in it. It was never founded on a specific type of, I guess, religious ideology, although there's a lot of Christian ideas that helped in the founding. And I think we can stress sort of the liberal values, the values we have in our Constitution. And those are values I think we would vet any immigrant coming into the country, no matter where they're from. I just don't think skin color really, or religion per se, should be the litmus test for that.
Yeah, and I don't even want to get too far into the woke right debate because we had James Lindsay on a couple of months back, and there's so much we could talk about, and it is a really fascinating conversation. I was just curious from your perspective as somebody who's kind of saw it, like you mentioned earlier, being ostracized from the left, and I do think there's a lesson in that for a lot of well-intentioned people on the right who saw what the left was doing to people like you and mocked the left for doing that to people like you, excoriated the left for doing that to people like you. And it's just really easy to be in a social media bubble when you spend a lot of time on X or YouTube in particular. And I wonder if you feel there are parallels between what you saw on the left and sort of circling the wagons and trying to keep people like you from having power or say in the broader left project with what you now see on the right, where you had made alliances in common cause with people against this priority of defeating a very bizarre, crazy ideology that was leading down the wildest roads.
I do see major parallels on either side. Woke left, woke right. I think the name or the label woke right, I think it is actually extremely illuminating to what's going on at a deeper level. A lot of people object to it because they just, in their minds, they associate wokeness with certain policy prescriptions like defund the police, gender affirming care, that type of stuff, or just like social justice jargon and other political slogans. Um, but when you look at the foundation of what wokeness was, it boiled down to like this sort of critical consciousness, being suddenly becoming aware to the power structures and collective identities that are sort of oppressing you. And we're seeing, I think, if you just look at wokeness as that sort of lens that you view the world, like when you inject left-wing politics as inputs to this distorting lens, it's going to create sort of these certain policy prescriptions. But if you put in right-wing conservative political ideas as the inputs, it's going to lead to different outputs, different sort of policy proposals, different ways to view it. But it's still the sort of oppressor oppressed. It's still, the structural systems of oppression that are after you that we need to become awake to. There's still all this collectivism that's involved. And so I just think it's good to point out these things. Now, I don't particularly care what term people use. I think that woke right is very illuminating and gets at what's happening at a fundamental level. But I don't like really just debating over what terms we use. I really would really appreciate if the people on the right would just try to acknowledge what me and people like James Lindsay and others are pointing at when we're saying woke right, rather than adopting the term itself, because I don't like the semantic debate. I want to talk about actual phenomena we see in the world. And so if they want to name it something else, I'm fine with that. I just want them to acknowledge this exists and that it's a problem, and that we should probably be criticizing that more than criticizing what term we use to call it out.
Something that makes it easy for groups to start purging and censoring is the sense of an existential threat, because that's when you end up having to implement litmus tests, and it's difficult because sometimes there are actual existential threats. And for the right, you're looking at the entire media for a long time and all of these corporations telling you that men and women are interchangeable, and that feels very much like an existential threat, just to the most fundamental questions and our ability to acknowledge reality and truth and all of that. And now I guess it's interesting that it seems like some of these litmus tests, now that the right is in power, they're very fearful of letting people in, because if they let people in who might dissent, then they feel like their ability to sort of attack the existential threat goes away. And that is similar to what we saw on the left. I'm curious what you make of this, Colin, because the left escalated, for example, trans issues to a matter of human rights, and to a matter of, they were saying that there's a rash of trans people being killed in crazy numbers every single year, and that data was always inflated. But it was, the same thing with police shootings of unarmed black men. Really, it's too high of a number, but when you did polling, people in the public thought that it was thousands a year, as opposed to what the number really was, because the narrative and the media was so extreme surrounding these issues. And so I think there's something about that feeling of an existential threat, which can sometimes be real, that makes it so the movements are more ready to purge. And I guess, Colin, having seen this on both sides, what do you say to people who do maybe have some good reason to be extremely concerned about the direction of society, but are also maybe alienating potential allies?
Yeah. So I do think that a lot of the disaffected liberals and people on the right were correct to point out how much of a problem that wokeness on the left was.
Mm.
I've heard people disparage these concerns as, oh, you're just like a single issue voter or something if you're voting to get rid of wokeness. But I wrote a piece where I talked about, well, it's not a single issue. It's kind of like almost like an every
Hmm.
issue because it's a lens through which people view almost every aspect of society. And so
That's why it was called
if you have a
critical
whole side of the
theory.
political spectrum that's adopting this lens,
Yeah.
then yeah, it's going to affect so much more. It's not just like abortion or immigration. It just touches on
Hmm.
everything.
Hmm.
Um, and so it was very much mainstreamed. You have like the fringes that were the true believers, but then you have this sort of warm blanket of people on the left who maybe don't describe to all the beliefs, but they won't push back on it, they won't criticize it.
Hmm.
And we see this, this emerging kind of on the right with the woke right, if we want to call it that. But I think they're kind of deluding themselves in a way because the vast majority of people, even on the right, aren't pro identity politics, white identity politics. It's going to be vastly unpopular, except for this extreme segment of the left that is all about this white identity politics, and they sort of eat and breathe anti-Semitism as well. And so I think we just need to do what the kind of left failed to do early on, and that's to call out this extreme segment,
Mm.
draw the battle lines, and say, absolutely not. We're not doing that. We're not going there. We need to push back because, if people on the left had done this in droves when the wokeness on the left started taking over, they might have been able to slow it or really nip it in the bud before it kind of took over the party and became, part of the zeitgeist of the entire left. So I'm glad that we're having the debates on the right kind of so early. There are a lot of prominent figures speaking out against that happening on the right because I think as James Lindsay said, there's nothing that the left is better at doing than like destroying like white identity politics. And so we have all the left against it. You have a majority of the right that's also against it. And so we just need to make sure that people who are influential in the right who are advocating for this stuff aren't getting into places of power. It doesn't become a larger cultural movement because I think they're just going to be diluted and they're setting themselves up for total disaster when we really can't afford to have the left come back and instill their wokeness and everything. I want to salt the earth of the whole left woke stuff, and that might require another presidency or two before they really get the message. So we'll see how that plays out.
Yeah, and my I have a lot of thoughts on the debate, but my basic position is that I think it's a good debate to have. So I'm glad you said that, Colin. Lastly, just even given your academic background, I'm curious what you make of the cultural conditions, the economic conditions that right now might be pushing people towards identity politics on this kind of transpartisan basis. Is there a reason that identity politics is, when Trump first came along, there was some conversation about why people were drifting into his camp, maybe for identity-based reasons, and whether that mirrored why the left was drifting towards what came to be called wokeness. But is there, from your perspective, something that could be addressed on like a root cultural, social, economic issue that would make these debates different? Or is this just the way the world is now, that we're, because of social media or whatever else, increasingly going to be gravitating towards identity-based politics and have to kind of work to get around it?
I think the identity-based politics, they're always going to be here. I think what a lot happened on the left was viewing the world in terms of like this zero-sum conflict for finite resources based on race. And so they really injected big time this anti-white identity politics. They wouldn't say anti-white; they would just say it's pro every single other identity, and just white isn't on there. But that's what it is. It's just fundamentally an anti-white, I think, movement. And part of the reasons I was against this to begin with is because I just saw that, like, okay, if you're doing this, even though didn't think white supremacy was like a major issue 5 or 10 years ago, I saw that, well, if you're just allowing identity politics to happen for every single group and celebrating it for every single group except for white people, like you're going to actually create that white supremacy, that white identity politics that was currently just barely there. And that's why I wanted to push back against it, because they're going to create the white supremacy, the white identity politics that they purport to be caring so much about eliminating. And I think we're seeing that happen right now. So now we get the people on the right that are looking at the world in this zero-sum conflict that everyone else is doing the identity politics. We need to do it too. Whereas you have all the classical liberals like me in the center saying like, how about we just go like identity politics for nobody? We just need to, which is sort of in a way a pie in the sky. There's always going to be some identity politics. We just need to get enough of a coalition of people to say we're done with this. We're done with it on the left. We need to be done with it on the right. I think most people are there, honestly. Like I think it's maybe not an 80-20 issue, but very much close to that, where people are just sick and tired of all this identity-based stuff and caring about giving people certain resources and things based on race rather than individual merit. I just think we need to champion that, and it's become increasingly hard to champion those things because you get attacked from both the right and the left. But there's, I think, a silent majority out there that is really giving support. And I do hear it all the time from people in my DMs and things like that.
Okay, that is my last question. As somebody who comes from the background that you did in academia and has had the experience that you had and the arc that you had, I've been asking people from the space that you occupy, like, is there like a sleeper cell of wokeness that's going to be like suddenly shocked back to life as soon as Donald Trump is out of power, as the like cultural momentum, the pendulum kind of swings back in another direction? Because it's hard for me to believe, as a millennial who went to a liberal arts school, that all of the people who were in the professional managerial class, who were in middle management, rising their way up from my generation, our generation, Colin, I think you're a millennial too, are just like that just went away forever. That is, not going to, when it's convenient, sort of reassert itself. What do you make of that?
Oh, yeah, it's still there. It's like the movie The Thing where it was like frozen in the ice, but like it'll emerge and just, when you least expect it. It's not even dormant. I mean, there's articles that are coming out just a couple days ago pushing back against the Trump administration with their definitions of sex, that is
Mm-hmm.
talking about sex not being binary and things like that. So it's still out there. It's still strong. There's still all the faculty. I mean, the universities are still overrun with these people, both in faculty and administration. Um, the primary reason I was, of supporting Trump as a candidate was because I thought that we needed to really get rid of or at least make so unpopular, so politically devastating to support these ideas. Um, that it would require something like a Donald Trump, or at least many years of this being a toxic ideology.
Mm.
I viewed Trump as sort of like a chemotherapy where it's going to destroy this cancer, but it also kind of harms the body as well in many ways. Or maybe you can think about it in terms of like taking antibiotics. You have to take the entire 10-day course of them to make sure that like everything's dead. And I viewed that as kind of what I was hoping that the Republicans would be doing now. But if we're going to devolve into identity politics on the right, we're just going to embolden the woke identity politics again. And if we don't let it just run its course and we get fully out of the system, it's just going to come back. It's just going to, like a bacterial infection. It's going to come back probably even stronger because they've had time to shift their narratives a little bit and things like that. So it worries me to no end that the left is going to be storming back with even more woke identity politics. So that's why I'm just like so concerned about seeing these similar ideologies and things like that, identity politics, show up on the right. So we need to keep calling this stuff out.
Hmm. Colin Wright, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on all of this. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it a lot too.
Thank you so much for tuning into Undercurrents. Make sure you subscribe at undercurrents.tv. Join the community. You get premium episodes that are just for subscribers. They're paywalled. They're just for you if you subscribe over at undercurrents.tv. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube. If you watch there, thank you so much. We will be back soon with more.